If you ever go to Engle Township, Minnesota, you'll see a pretty normal American small town. There's a post office, a fire station, and even an elementary school. But after a quick and not so thorough examination, you'll find one pretty big problem with the town. It's surrounded by Canada. The residents that live in this exclave have to cross international borders 4 times a day just to go out to eat or to get their hair cut. And the funny thing is, Engle, Minnesota isn't the only place you'll find these types of border problems across the United States-Canada border, and as a matter of fact, they're quite common. The root of these problems stems back to 1783 at the Treaty of Paris, when the newly established Americans were negotiating their new border with Britain. Unfortunately, the maps they used back then were not 100% accurate, and at that time, very little of the western frontier was mapped out anyway. The two parties decided that the northwest corner of the new nation would be the point where the Mississippi River crosses the line directly west from the northwest corner of the Lake of the Woods, which seems fine until a few years later, they discovered that the Mississippi River doesn't run that far. And since the US had acquired a bunch more of that sweet new territory, a new treaty had to be made. The Treaty of 1818, and again the Treaty of 1846, established the 49th parallel as the border we know and love today. So the border rose up to the northwest corner of the Lake of the Woods, and then back down to the 49th parallel, cutting off the Engle from the rest of the nation. Once the 49th parallel was established as the border, the next big challenge was actually mapping out the border. The men who surveyed the land built over 900 monuments marking the border along the 49th. But the monuments aren't exactly on the 49th parallel since the surveyors didn't have an exact GPS, and some are even off by a few hundred feet. The men also cut a 20-foot, or 6-meter wide if you're watching this from Canada, line out of the forest, all the way from Maine to Washington, and today later to Alaska. Yes, I'm not joking. This border zone stretches over 5,000 miles and goes through every bit of forest and every bit of mountain in its path. Even though the US and Canada may seem friendly, they want it to remain pretty clear which side is theirs, and this deforested line is still maintained today. And it turns out, if you're going to draw a 1,000 mile long across a continent, you'll likely create a few more border issues along the way. Thankfully, Vancouver Island is hard to miss and was spotted in advance, and the US agreed to let Canada retain control of the entirety of it. But just next door to Vancouver Island is the American town of Point Roberts, Washington. The town is only accessible by driving south from Canadian territory, and Point Roberts even receives its municipalities from Vancouver. But nonetheless, since Point Roberts sits just below the 49th parallel, it remains part of the state of Washington and is home to around 1,000 Americans. High school students have to cross the international border 4 times per day just for their education. And that's important to note. All of these several border towns, whether US or Canadian, rely on the relatively unified and open border of the two nations. For decades, there was little to no security at the border between most of these towns, and most of the people's lives depended on that. But everything changed on September 11th, 2001. At precisely 10:05 a.m., the entire US border was shut down, stranding all Americans in towns like Point Roberts and Engle Township, Minnesota, in their own country. These towns' economies and lives were devastated. Children were not allowed to go to school, and adults were not able to travel to work. This sparked even more drama at the border than ever before. And even though the border has slowly begun to reopen, it has never quite been the same. Anyone coming or going from the border would have to provide passports and official documentation, as well as be subject to detainments and car searches. And in more recent years, the COVID-19 pandemic hasn't made anything easier. The new addition of vaccinations and COVID tests to enter Canada has all but destroyed these border towns' economies and livelihoods. The US-Canada border still remains the largest border between two nations in the world, and it is still known for its openness and lack of hostility surrounding it. But the border still has a few major flaws, especially the isolation of many peculiar border towns, often isolating its own inhabitants from their own country. But it should be noted that throughout the history of both nations have worked hard with one another, not only to well establish the border, but to keep it open and friendly. The world's weirdest border is still often an example to the world of prosperity and friendship between two nations.